Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome back to the channel. Today we will be discussing Dracula. You cannot have a conversation about gothic horror without talking about Dracula. Dracula is not only the most well-known gothic horror of all time, it is one of the most well-known books of all time. The second you hear the name Dracula, you think about vampires, you think about bats and wolves and this barren countryside and this dark, creepy castle. You think about garlic, you think about crucifixes, you think about coffins. The name Dracula evokes an immediate imagery. And so I thought, what a perfect book for us to cover for our Halloween special. Especially given the fact that I was assigned to read this in high school and I didn't finish it. I remember at the time we were learning about the idea of static and dynamic characters. A dynamic character is a character that changes throughout the story. The events of the story have an impact on them and we watch them change and grow, or sometimes recess and become a better person, a worse person, or the same level morality person, just in a different way throughout the duration of the narrative. Where a static character is a character that doesn't really change. So who they are at the beginning of the story is who they also are at the end. Now, broadly speaking, dynamic characters are considered to be better than static characters. It's maybe not always the best idea to think of it that way. Static characters can sometimes serve a purpose in a narrative. Static versus dynamic characters are just tools in your arsenal as an author, the same way that anything is in writing. But I was 14, maybe 15 at the time, didn't really like to be forced to read for school as much as I enjoyed reading in general. I remember not really liking the parts of this book that I did read and feeling like the world of literature at large was selling me this story about Dracula being this epic example of well-used static characters to cover for the fact that it was a classic novel that had stood the test of time, but wasn't maybe actually that good a book. And that everyone was kind of inventing this conversation around static characters because they didn't want to admit that a book that wasn't even really that good ended up lasting a very long time. I'm pretty sure that's what I wrote my essay about, and I got an A. But I will confess to you here that I know for a fact I did not finish the book, and I did not enjoy reading it. So I went into this read as an adult with that in mind. I wanted to know, was my 14, 15-year-old sense on this book correct? Or is it actually a great example of static characters used well? I'm going to give you a few other facts about it before we dive in, just for some context. The first is that it was written by Bram Stoker and published in 1897. The second is that it isn't actually the original vampire novel. There are other novels that came before it that told vampire stories. The biggest name is Carmilla, but Dracula is the book that popularized the genre and is the book that has stood the test of time. The other thing that we need to know going in is that Dracula is an epistolary novel. An epistolary novel is a style of a fiction novel. The events of this story are fiction, but they are told through diary entries and letters and correspondence between a lot of the characters involved. So there is this implication of them being real world events that were documented as opposed to a stream of consciousness narrative that somebody is telling you about. So as we're reading this book, everything we're reading is either a diary entry of one of the characters, or it's a letter between the characters, or it's a telegram of some kind, or it's a newspaper article, all of which is collected together in a scrapbook of sorts to tell the story. Now, I know that I have some very particular literary aficionados in my audience, so I do want to clarify that it is still an epistolary novel, even if it's not just letters. Some people think epistolary just means letters or correspondence of some kind. It still is an epistolary novel if there's things like newspaper articles and diary entries in there. It's just that the most common form of epistolary novel is usually predominantly letters. And finally, full spoilers. I will just be talking about the plot, so if you don't want it spoiled, don't watch the video. And with that, we are finally ready to dive into the life and times of Count Dracula and how he met his end. This book is about 400 pages, or at least my copy of it is, and the first 50-ish pages are all told in Jonathan Harker's diary. Jonathan Harker is a lawyer who recently became a lawyer in England and is traveling to Transylvania, which at the time existed and is now a part of Romania. So whenever I say Transylvania or some of the other places surrounding Transylvania, imagine Romania in your mind. That's where in the world that is. Jonathan is on his way from England to Transylvania to finish brokering a deal where Count Dracula is going to be buying some property in London because he wants to move there. Jonathan Harker has never met or corresponded with Count Dracula, but the partner at his law firm has asked him to do this because he's not well enough to make the trip himself. His fiancée, Mina, is trying to learn shorthand because she wants to work as his secretary, and so he decides to keep a diary in shorthand so that when he gets back from his trip, she can practice transcribing it, and it can partially be practice for her and also partially be how she hears of his travels. Much like with Jonathan, with the rest of the characters and when they all start their journals/diaries, we always get a reason why they're keeping the journal or diary, which I just think is really interesting. They're always explaining to us why they're keeping a diary. I feel like I've never started out a diary like, I want to keep this diary for XYZ reasons, but I digress. As he's traveling to Count Dracula's castle, all of the locals are reacting very harshly when they find out where he's going. They're crossing themselves. Jonathan doesn't really understand why everybody's reacting in this way, and he chalks it up to a lot of the locals being very superstitious. Now, I will warn you, if you've ever considered reading this book, it becomes very apparent very quickly that it was written by a white man in the late 1800s. Not just written by a white man, but written by a European white man, where they have a very special form of racism that transcends race itself. I don't know if you would call it racism or nationalism, maybe is a better word for it, but in Europe, and especially in Europe in the 1800s, there was a lot of hatred between the different European countries, and they didn't like each other very much a lot of the time. The way that certain people are portrayed in this book is not for the faint of heart. It's quite offensive, and specifically the Romani people, the Slovakians. There's other populations, and I'll warn as we go, but especially in these early pages as I'm reading it, the way the Romani were talked about and the way that the Slovakians were talked about was just like very hackle inducing for anybody with a more modern day temperament. Anyway, let's dive back into the plot. So Jonathan Harker is on his way to Transylvania to broker this deal with Count Dracula. And on the way there, everybody is telling him not to go, but he kind of writes it off as the people being very superstitious, doesn't really think much of it. In his mind, he's just going to broker a land deal. Why would it be a very big deal? But then when he's actually riding up to the castle with the person driving the carriage, it's late at night, it's snowing, there's wolves howling, and he has a moment where he's like, okay, maybe people were onto something. This is really spooky. I don't know what's going on. And they start to get tracked by these wolves, and the coach driver gets out of the car and is actually able to like calm all the wolves down in a way that Jonathan doesn't really understand, and it confuses him. But then they get to the castle and he meets Count Dracula, who is this old man with white hair who is very hospitable to Jonathan right at first. But Jonathan does notice some very strange things about him after a few days of being there. The first being that he's never really awake during the day, and the second that he never sees him eat. And at one point they have a very strange experience where he can't see Dracula in a mirror. There's no mirrors in the house, but he has his little shaving mirror that he uses to shave, and Dracula walks up behind him and he can't see Dracula in the mirror, but he doesn't know what this means. But Dracula throws his mirror out the window and breaks it, and Jonathan's just really confused by the whole experience. But because of those few things, Dracula at some point decides that unfortunately Jonathan Harker can't survive this extravaganza at his castle because he knows too much about Dracula potentially being of the supernatural, although we don't know a whole lot right now as to what that would mean. The rest of Jonathan Harker's journal during this time is mostly focused around him realizing that he's a prisoner, trying to escape, failing to escape. There's some other vampires that come and try to drink his blood. They're all very attractive women, but Dracula scares them off and says that they can have him when he's done with him. And then Dracula forces him to write all these letters saying that he's traveling home. And then Dracula sneaks out of the house in the night dressed as Jonathan Harker to go post the letters. And Jonathan realizes that he's trying to set this trail so that if people come looking for him, they don't go back to Castle Dracula and think he disappeared somewhere else. He ends up discovering at some point that Dracula is asleep in a coffin tomb of sorts in the basement. All of this adds up to the point where Jonathan realizes that Dracula has left to go to London, and that means that the other vampires, although he doesn't know they're vampires at the time, are going to kill him. And so he decides to brave climbing out the window and down the side. He hadn't done that before because the castle is on 3 sides over this cliff face. It's actually quite a famous visualization of a castle, but it's basically juts out on 3 sides where there's sheer cliff faces. And Jonathan doesn't have access to the part of the castle that's facing the front. So he has to climb out over the cliff to climb around. But at the end of his time there, he decides that it's worth the risk. And the last thing that we read in this journal at this point in time is him saying he's going to try to climb out the window. But if he fails and they discover his body, that he hopes that Mina finds the journal and says goodbye to her. Then we go back in time a little bit. All of the things included in the novel aren't always included in chronological order, but really there's a specific part of the novel in which that happens. And so I didn't feel like it was worth trying to lay out for you exactly what happens where. I'm just kind of going to give a general description of the plot of this next part. Basically, we have Mina, Lucy, and Dr. Seward's perspective in this part. Mina is at first very excited that Jonathan has just sent a letter saying that he's on his way home, but she's a little bit confused because it's clearly his handwriting, but the writing doesn't really sound like him, and this kind of throws her off, but she decides not to worry about it too much, and she goes to visit her friend Lucy in Whitby. Mina is engaged to Jonathan. Lucy has told Mina in letters that she had 3 different men propose to her on the same day. Dr. Seward, who's the other perspective we have in this part, who is the owner and operator of an insane asylum, a black man from America named Quincy, and this Lord guy, I'm gonna be honest with you, I never quite caught what his actual title was, but that third guy, Arthur, is the guy she's actually in love with, and that's the proposal that she accepts. What we'll find from this point out is a trend where I think we spend a lot more writing on plot points than we really need. There's a lot of nitty-gritty plot, but the best that I can overarchingly summarize this part is that for the first bit, Mina and Lucy are hanging out in Whitby, and Lucy has taken to sleepwalking. This concerns Mina, but she's not really sure what to do about it, and there's all these other strange things happening in Whitby at the time. And over this time, Mina growingly gets more and more concerned about Jonathan because she hasn't heard anything about him, until she one day receives a letter saying that he's been cared for at this other place. He had this shock and he's having a nervous breakdown, and he finally was calm enough to tell them who he was, and they were able to write her to come and help. And so she obviously goes to help with Jonathan. And throughout all of this, there is interspersed the perspective of Dr. Seward, who is both sad that he was rejected by Lucy, but happy for her. He doesn't really blame her. He misses her, but he has this nice distraction because one of his patients, Renfield, is being really, really strange and is trapping all these flies and then feeding the flies to spiders and then feeding the spiders to birds. And then he wanted a cat that he could feed all the birds to. And the doctor was like, I don't really want to give you a cat, to be honest. I'm a little bit concerned about what you're going to do with it. And that concern was well placed because when he comes back to Renfield's room, cell, both probably just about, Renfield has eaten all the birds. And when Dr. Seward's like, why did you do that? Renfield is like, because I want to absorb their life. I forget if it's directly explained by Renfield or if Dr. Seward comes to the conclusion that Renfield is obsessed with the idea of consuming as much life as possible and doing it in a very efficient way. So he was trying to feed the flies to the spiders and then feed the spiders to the birds and then feed all the birds to the cat so that he could eat the cat and consume all of that life in one, but that he compromised when he couldn't get a cat by just eating all the birds. That's kind of spooky and weird and freaky. And so Dr. Seward's pretty focused on that until Mina leaves. And once Mina leaves Whitby, Lucy starts to get progressively worse and more sick. And Lucy's fiance is concerned about her and calls on Dr. Seward to help because they've had her looked at by a doctor and they can't find anything wrong with her. They don't know what's actually wrong. And so they assume that it might be a mental issue as opposed to an actual physical issue, but she's getting weaker and she has less energy and all this stuff. So Dr. Seward agrees to help. And as soon as he starts seeing her, he can't really figure out what's wrong with her and admits that it's a little bit beyond him. And he calls on a friend of his named Van Helsing, who lives in Amsterdam, to come and take a look at her. He basically is like, if I can't figure it out, Van Helsing will definitely be able to figure out what's wrong with her. And Van Helsing almost immediately does figure out what's wrong, like for real. Like he clearly knows almost from the jump that a vampire is doing this to her. And so we, the reader, if we know this is a vampire story, also kind of know that, but a lot of the other characters in the book don't know that. And this was the point where I thought to myself, I wonder how fun this book would be to read if I didn't know it was about vampires. If it actually was the biggest hit of the genre in the way everybody says, did people who picked it up at the time know it was a vampire novel going into it? And would it have been a fun mystery read if I hadn't already known that. But obviously I'm reading it already knowing that, so I knew basically the second Lucy started to sleepwalk and not feel good that it was Dracula sucking her blood. Van Helsing starts having them do blood transfusions to make her feel better. They start with her fiance Arthur, but he's not always there because his father's also sick, so he's splitting time between Lucy and his father. And then Dr. Seward gives blood, and then Van Helsing gives his blood, and finally, Quincy also ends up giving her his blood. I forget why he was there. We'll talk about Quincy. I have thoughts on Quincy. He's just kind of always around. Quincy also at one point gives blood, but despite their best efforts giving her blood and trying to protect her from Dracula, there seems to be almost this fated death for her, where as hard as they try, they cannot really prevent her death. They put a bunch of garlic in the room so Dracula can't get in, and then her mother clears it all out because she's like, it's so stuffy in here and you can smell the garlic so strong. She needs fresh air. Different things keep happening and she ends up slipping through their fingers and dying. All of the men are very, very sad about this, and still most of them have no idea what she died from or why. Van Helsing is the only one who knows that. And after they bury her, Van Helsing says to Dr. Seward, oh, there's actually one more thing we have to do, and we have to break into her tomb to do it. And Dr. Seward's obviously like, what on earth are you talking about, man? Ew. What? You want to break into her tomb? And Van Helsing is like, trust me. You trusted me and my methods helped Lucy even if they weren't able to save her. So do you trust me now? And do you trust that I'm not giving you all the information for a reason? And Dr. Seward's like, okay, fine, whatever. And they break into her tomb in the middle of the night and they open her casket and the body isn't there. And that's when Van Helsing tells Dr. Seward that Lucy was killed by a vampire. And because she was killed by a vampire, she became a vampire when she died. And he also tells Dr. Seward that he didn't tell him ahead of time because he didn't think that he'd believe him. Still, Dr. Seward is having a very hard time believing him. And there's actually quite a funny exchange between them where Van Helsing says, well, what do you think about the body not being here? And Dr. Seward says, I think it means the body's not there. Like, he's like, what are you talking about? And Van Helsing is like, all right, we'll come back tomorrow and that's when I'll prove it to you. And so they come back to the tomb during the day and they open her casket again and they see that the body is there. And Dr. Seward is like, what on earth? How is the body here? And Van Helsing is like, I told you, it's because she's undead. She is sleeping during the day and getting up in the middle of the night and running around and wreaking havoc on the local children. And Dr. Seward is like, oh, okay, well, how do we stop her from doing that? Van Helsing tells him that he feels that they have to tell her fiance what is going on with her and that they need to leave her alive until then so that he can prove it the way he proved it to Dr. Seward. And so they bring Quincy and Arthur. They bring them both into the situation and they prove to them that Lucy is a vampire. And then Van Helsing shows them how to kill a vampire. And the way that they do it with her is by staking her through the heart. But he also says that cutting off the head and stuffing garlic in the mouth will do. And that when they stake her through the heart, as she's dying, she's like flailing around, but when she is fully dead, she looks more like a dead human because Dr. Seward kept remarking how beautiful and almost sleeping she looked in her coffin and things like that during the funeral. And so once they kill the vampire piece of her, then she's fully at rest and fully dead and just looks like a dead human. Everybody's like, okay, cool, yay. We put her soul to rest. But Van Helsing's like, oh ho ho, our work is not done because there's a vampire out there that did this to her and we have to find him and kill him so that he can't do this to other people. And everybody's like, yeah, let's go hunt the vampire. And this is when Mina and Jonathan come back into the picture. So Mina's been caring for Jonathan through this whole time and Jonathan isn't doing well with what happened. He doesn't really remember what happened, and when he tries to think about it, he goes back into a nervous breakdown. But he has the journal, but he gives it to Mina and he tells her that he's okay with her reading it if she wants to, but that if she does decide to read it, he doesn't want her to tell him what's in it because he's worried about his own health. She decides not to read it right at first, but later changes her mind and ends up reading it because when they get back to, I forget if they go to London or Whitby, I don't think it really matters, but she finds out that Lucy has died and she's obviously very sad about this because Lucy was her friend. Jonathan sees Count Dracula out and about walking around, but he looks younger and he's very confused by this and he doesn't really understand how this can be the case, but he also doesn't really remember everything still and he doesn't know how he feels. When Jonathan sees Dracula and kind of freaks out, Mina decides to read his journal because she wants to be able to help protect him from his own nervous breakdowns and understand what it is that sets him off. And so she reads the journal and remarks to herself that she doesn't really know if it's fact or fiction. But obviously her now husband, they did also get married in that time. Her now husband has been through quite the fright. She at that point in time isn't sure if it's real or if it was imagined by him. Then, if my memory serves, and forgive me if I don't have this exactly correct because I don't have it in my notes, but I believe that Mina offers to transcribe Dr. Seward's phonograph diary for him because he was keeping his diary in a phonograph. It's an old audio recording machine, and when she does, she draws a bunch of parallels between some of the stuff with Renfield and some of the different stuff he's saying and doing and talking about, because he's also been like muttering random things and saying random things out loud, and he's been obsessed with the house next door and running over there and crying out for a master and things like that. And she is able to piece together the connections between Jonathan and what happened to him and this stuff with Renfield, but he holds back the pieces of it that describe them killing Vampire Lucy because he doesn't want to put this on Mina. And here's where we start to see something that was very frustrating for me in my read, but again, I'm wondering upon reflection if there was some point to it. Again, while I was reading it, I just felt like it was really obvious that it was written by a white man from the 1800s, especially in how he treated the female characters and how all of the men were described as these like incredible men, these good men, and the women are like, oh, we don't deserve such good men in our lives, and oh, he's so manly and great and such a good man. Honestly, they say that kind of stuff to each other so often. If you cut out every line of these characters saying to each other, let us be friends, or oh, you're such a good man, you're such a holy man, or you're such a good woman, what a great woman, genuinely this book would be like 100 pages shorter. Like that actually repeats so much. There does become this sort of repetitive pattern of them wanting to protect Mina from everything going on because she's not as strong as them because they're men and she's a woman. They don't want her to have a nervous breakdown. But they go back and forth between that and incorporating her into their investigation and trying to find Count Dracula. Even as you're reading it, you notice that when they have Mina involved, like really Mina is the brains behind the operation, and she's the one who keeps figuring out like everything to do with this Dracula stuff, and yet they keep trying to hide it from her. But anyway, so she puts together that there's this connection between Jonathan and Renfield and asks to listen to the rest of the diary, and Seward lets her, and then she realizes that the Count Dracula that Jonathan interacted with is probably the vampire that killed Lucy. And so they start to put all of the papers together to put together all of the evidence that they have. And this is where we get the book within the book, where it's heavily implied that everything that they're reading is what they put together in order to have all the evidence that they had to try and figure out where Dracula was and how to kill him. And then the rest of the book is them pursuing him. The only other thing that really matters is that Renfield tries to get out, tries to have Dr. Seward let him out, but Dr. Seward doesn't let him out. And Renfield says to him, you will regret this. And he's like, let it be known that I tried to warn you. And a few days later, Renfield is found thrown on the ground, broken back. They don't really understand how he got so injured in his own cell. Dracula needs to be invited in, right? Vampires need to be invited in order to enter a building. And so Dracula had essentially manipulated him to invite Dracula into the sanitarium where Mina was staying. Not because she was insane or anything, but they were staying in like the rooms with Dr. Seward, not in the actual sanitarium, but that's where she was. And all the men were out trying to find Dracula when Dracula basically sneaks in and bites Mina. When they find her, Dracula is having her drink his blood. And this is where we find out that there's actually two ways for somebody to become a vampire. One is to have been killed by a vampire, and the other is for them to have had their blood drunk by a vampire and drink the vampire's blood and then die. And so now if Mina dies, she will become one of the undead, and they obviously don't want that to happen to her. But if they hunt down Dracula and they kill him, I forget honestly if it's that if they kill Dracula, they'll kill all the vampires created by him, like some sort of bizarre vampire pyramid scheme where all of the vampires made by him can only be alive if he's alive. But I actually think that it's if you were a human bitten by Dracula and Dracula's done this where he's drunk your blood and then you drink his blood, and then if you're still human when he dies, you won't become a vampire. But it still very much has like a vampire pyramid scheme kind of feel. The only other thing that really matters for this whole part where they're hunting him down and chasing him is that he had a bunch of coffins that could be where he rests for the night, or the day, I suppose. And these coffins are very important to him. If he doesn't have a single one, then he cannot use the majority of his powers, and he's trapped in the form that he's in. And so Van Helsing says the way that we're going to kill him is by basically rendering all of his coffins useless, so he can't sleep in any of them, and then he'll be stuck and he can't transform out of his human form, and then he'll still be super strong and have some other powers, but this really limits his power and we'll be able to trap him and kill him. And everybody agrees to this plan, and while they're still in London, they manage to track down where he put all of his coffins, and they render most of them unusable by him by opening them and putting the Eucharist inside. We will end up talking very in depth about the Eucharist. All we need to know at this point in time is that it's a holy thing within really all of Christianity, but is especially important to the Catholic Church. Keep that in mind. They end up basically purifying all of his coffins so that he can't get in them. But unfortunately, he had hidden one as a contingency plan, and so he manages to escape London and is on his way back to Transylvania to try and wrest basically out the human lives of all of these humans that are hunting him in order to escape them hunting him and then to probably try again after. But they manage to track him down, they manage to kill him, so they free Mina, and Quincy is the only one who dies in the process. So he dies, but everybody else survives the ordeal. And then you fast forward 7 years later, where you find out that Mina and Jonathan have a son that was born on the same day Quincy died years later, and that they named him Quincy. That's the end of the book. What did I actually think of it immediately upon finishing reading it? I'll admit to you, I had a little bit of a sense that my younger self might have been onto something. It's not that this book wasn't entertaining. I don't want to say that at all. But I do think that specifically the amount to which they said to each other, oh, you're just such a good person, and the amount of this book that was dedicated to the characters just having this like circle jerk of how good they all were and how much they didn't deserve this happening to them and stuff. I'm not joking when I tell you, you could probably take out 100 pages of this book that are just that. It wasn't even just that all the characters were static in that they didn't change throughout the narrative, but they really blended in with each other, where it was sometimes hard to, if I just picked the book up at random and it wasn't on a page where it said whether you were in Jonathan's diary or Mina's diary or whatever it might be, it was very hard to know whose perspective you were in. They all sounded the same, they all kind of behaved the same, nobody really had any personality. Dracula honestly has the most personality of any of these characters, which we only really see in the first 50 or 60 pages from Jonathan's perspective, where he is this creepy yet suave, something's not quite right with him, but he's charismatic and he's kind to Jonathan, and Jonathan actually likes him right at first. He has the most personality of any of the characters, but you only see it in the first 50 pages, and then otherwise he's basically this shadow monster for the rest of the book where you don't really spend that much time with him super close up. Despite that, I did want to know what happened. I was worried about Lucy, I was worried about Mina. I mean, I know enough about the story to know that Lucy died, so I knew that it was kind of fruitless, but I was hoping that I maybe remembered wrong anyway, because I did really like her, and I really liked Mina too. I wanted to know, were they gonna succeed at killing Dracula? Some of the vampire lore stuff was really fun, and it definitely was a thriller. But I almost feel that the thriller aspect of it, combined with how much of the pages felt wasted to me, was part of why it was hard to enjoy, because it's like you're on the edge of your seat, you want to know what happened, but now you've got to read 4 or 5 pages of these characters circle jerking each other before you can get to more action, and you're just like, oh my god, like this again, are you serious? But also, books at the time had more of a tendency to do that, and people had better attention spans back then than they do now, and people spent more time reading because that basically was the way to get your stories unless you were going to the theater or the opera. There wasn't any TV, there wasn't cell phone, so this is how people got their entertainment. And so a lot of classics can be a lot more long-winded than modern day novels because there isn't as much pressure on the authors to hold your attention, because what else are you going to do with your night? Not that they didn't have other things to do for fun at the time, but you get what I'm saying, right? Outside of that, the book was quite enjoyable and it did hold me. And so as much as I didn't really like Bram Stoker's character work at first, I was overall a fan of the book. I get why it stood the test of time. It is very creepy. It gives you the heebie-jeebies at points, and I will admit the big flowers that I will give it and the big compliment that I will give it is that it's a gothic horror, it's meant to be a horror novel, and it sure did horrify me. I am very sensitive to horrors. It's why I don't really read them that often. I'm a little baby. I don't know what to tell you, okay? I get spooked very, very easily. And over the course of the few days I was reading it, I woke up in the middle of the night at one point to go to the bathroom, and on my way back to my bed, I saw a shadow, and I ran to my bed and dove in and like huddled under the blankets, and I was like, what the fuck was that? And I turned on my lamp and everything. That kind of stuff happens to me when I read horror novels. That's why I don't like reading them, and that's why I don't like watching horror movies either, because they get to me. Like sometimes at night, I'm like, what was that? Is Dracula in my house? But I was spooked. I was a little spooked, and for just a second, it crossed my mind, what if Dracula's real? Just what if? That's how I know it's a good horror. Yeah, this one got to me. It was creepy. And I didn't go into it anticipating that, because I think that sometimes with especially older horrors, they prey on a lot of the fears of the time. At the time that Dracula was written, it's more realistic that there would have been a large number of people who believed that vampires were real, or at the very least had the superstitious, like maybe they're real, maybe they're not. Whereas in the modern day, we pretty much are settled on the idea that they're not. And so I wasn't really expecting this book to like actually creep me out IRL. So it did its job. It got to me. Cool. So those were kind of my immediate thoughts upon finishing the book. However, obviously that's not all there's going to be to it, especially with a classic. If you're reading a book that was written a very long time ago, it's very important for you to look up who the author was, where they lived, certain things about their life in order to understand what they potentially were trying to say. You can never remove art from the historical context in which it was created, lest you end up misunderstanding what the point of what the author was trying to say was. And I will tell you that at that time, I hadn't given that much thought to what the theme was or anything like that. I was just kind of doing some preliminary research into Bram Stoker. When I had finished the book, I had somewhat subconsciously just settled on the facts that Bram Stoker was an Englishman and Catholic, because the way the characters talk about London in this book is exhausting. It's exactly how people from New York talk about New York City. It's like, it's the best city on earth. It's the only place that it's worth being. Of course, Dracula would want to move to London, because who wouldn't want to move to London? It's the best city, full of the best people in the best country, blah, 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 blah. And so I had just kind of assumed that it was written by an Englishman. And then there's a ton of Catholic imagery as well. And a lot of the objects that they use to fight Dracula are not just Christian objects, but they're specifically objects that are associated with the Catholic denomination of Christianity. And so the good guys like used all of these Catholic tools to banish this demon. And so you can imagine my shock when I Googled Bram Stoker and found out that he was an Irish Protestant. Pardon me, I can't think of two things that an Irish Protestant in the late 1800s would hate more than the Catholic Church and the state of England in that order. Safe to assume he was not a fan. So where did I go wrong? Because if I read the book and I felt like all of these characters were very almost sycophantically fans of London, and also it never directly says that any of them are Catholic, but they're using rosaries and the Eucharist and holy water and things that are, again, specifically associated with Catholicism to fight this demon. Why would he do all of that? Maybe just because that's the vampire lore, and that's what at the time it was believed fought the vampires. And that is a theory. There is a theory in the interpretation of this book that is just that that was the lore, and so that's what Bram Stoker used because that was the lore. But I have told you guys before that sometimes it frustrates me when people come to a conclusion about a book and think that they just came to that conclusion and that it wasn't an intentional effort by the author to get that across. So if I look at the author's life and times and I think to myself, okay, he probably wasn't a fan of England, and he probably also wasn't a very big fan of the Catholic Church. Did he portray them well in the story? And then I go back to my own feelings upon finishing the book and realize my interpretation walking away was that these characters were sycophantically fans of these things in a way that was very off-putting for me. And also, I already told you guys that they were almost jerking each other off with how self-righteous they all were and how much they complimented each other and how holy they all were and how good they all were and how much they didn't deserve this devil coming into their lives and how annoying all of that was. And I really didn't like a lot of the main characters towards the end of the book and found them to be quite irritating. And myself reading it, I was like, damn, they're a really big fan of England and they're really big fans of each other and they're very self-righteous and they consider themselves to be like the holiest people on earth. And then I started to think about the different ways in which they used Catholic imagery in the book. And specifically, my brain jumped back to the Eucharist. Because of course it did, because now we're talking about the Catholics versus the Protestants. In order to understand the message I think Bram Stoker was trying to send, I do have to explain A, what the Eucharist is, and B, how the belief surrounding it differs between Catholicism and the various forms of Protestant. And that is considered to be one of the fundamental differences between Catholic and Protestant. Whenever we talk about religion on this channel, I always like to take a second to clarify that to me, all that really matters is the religious themes in the book and how they play out. I'm trying to tell you what the beliefs in these religions are so that you can understand what point I think Bram Stoker was making. And also, just before anybody comments, Protestant is an umbrella. So there's a bunch of organized religions within the Protestant umbrella, but it's safe to assume that all of them hate the Catholics and the Catholics hate all of them, and they despise each other, especially in Europe. In the Bible, there is the story of the Last Supper, where there was Jesus and he had the bread and the blood, and he said, "Take this, all of you, and eat it or drink from it. This is my body or blood, which I have given up for you," or whatever. And he gives it to all of the disciples and they drink it, and this is the night before he's crucified. The symbolism behind the Eucharist, very important to any denomination of Christianity. However, the Catholics believe in a concept called transubstantiation. I hope I said that right. Which is the belief that when the priest blesses the crackers and the wine that they use at Mass, it's not symbolic of Jesus's sacrifice, that those items actually become Jesus's body and blood, even if they still appear to us as a cracker and wine. So within the Catholic religion, when you take communion at Mass, what you are consuming is Jesus's body and blood physically. It's not a metaphor. This is very, very important to understand. If you go to a Catholic Mass and you drink the wine, you are drinking Jesus's blood within the Catholic religion. That is the belief. Whereas in the various Protestant denominations, it's believed to be symbolic. So there's this whole ceremony to honor and celebrate the fact that this happened, but that is in fact a cracker and that is in fact wine. So that is the difference between the beliefs, right? Did anything I just say trigger anything for you as it pertains to vampires? Think about everything I just said and then think about vampires. Blood drinking, right? The vampires are blood drinkers. And one could argue that Catholics are also blood drinkers. They drink Jesus's blood at Mass. Whoa. That's a lot to unpack. So, but wait a minute, why were they using all of this Catholic imagery to fight Dracula if Dracula himself and the vampires are perchance supposed to be the Catholics themselves and to be representative of them? Going back to the Eucharist specifically, there's actually very many moments in the book in which the characters chew up the Eucharist, like the crackers, and spit it out and stuff it into little cracks so that Dracula can't weasel his way out of places. And I will admit to you, as somebody who was raised Catholic, this raised my hackles a little bit. Like the idea that they actually took the host and did that, it was a little bit like, ugh, it's a little disrespectful, but like, okay. Maybe that was the point, right? Where these characters that are super self-righteous and think like crazy highly of themselves are desecrating these Catholic symbols in order to fight against this evil that is also low-key its own Catholic allegory. And then you find out that I knew, based off of some of what was said in the book, that Dracula, the character, is supposed to be based on a real person, but I didn't know enough about the history of this region to know who it was supposed to be until after I finished the book. And when I started looking that up too, I found out that within the story, Dracula is a guy they called Dracula as a nickname, but was also known as Vlad the Impaler, who was the king of what again is now Romania. It was called like Wallachia or something like that. He actually freed them from rule from the Ottoman Empire, which is now around where Turkey is. There was a lot of fighting and a lot of strife between his people and the Turks for a long time. The Turks were Muslim, and the now Romanian people then, again, I think it's like Wallachia or something like that, were Christian. They were Christian Orthodox. They weren't Catholic, but still. And Vlad was himself a very cruel and violent ruler, and he was awful to any Muslims that lived in Romania. And I mean, do not look it up if you are queasy, because it's not fun to read about some of the stuff he used to do. And he did it all in the name of Christianity. And you can find people to this day who are defending him or who are saying that he wasn't as cruel or awful as people framed him out to be, because he was doing it to free his people from the Ottoman Empire rule and then to defend Christianity. So we have this figure who did all these awful things in the name of Christianity, who within the book sold his soul to the devil to free his people, basically, from the Ottoman Empire. So he gained all these vampire powers from the devil in order to be able to fight the Ottoman Empire and free his people. And so he is the king of the vampires, and every other vampire on Earth is descended from him, and he has created them. And he's lived all these hundreds of years. And now he's trying to go to London to continue to colonize. And he's very much framed as a colonizer in a sense, and he's trying to go there and infect the people of London. And so I'm digging into all of this, and I'm like, okay, so now I think that potentially Dracula is himself supposed to represent the Catholics, who have a long and storied history of committing a lot of violence and depravity in the name of their religion. They're not alone in that. Like I said, Vlad the Impaler was Christian Orthodox, but still. Then you find out that at the time in Ireland, there was this Irish nationalist movement that was coming from the Catholic people of Ireland. There was a law that barred Catholics from holding any parliament office, and there was this movement that was spearheaded by this one guy whose name I forget, hang on, Charles Stewart Parnell. Parnell wanted to hold office, but he couldn't because he was a Catholic, and so he started this movement in order to get this law abolished that also was somewhat based in the push for Irish independence from England, because England still had control of Ireland at the time. And now that I know all of this historical context, I actually think that this whole book is a giant commentary on Catholicism. Even the static character part, I know you either die the hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Now I'm defending it. But I do actually think he did it on purpose, because at the time, despite the Christian religion at large painting itself to be the religion of forgiveness, you'll find that historically there hasn't always been a ton of actual forgiveness associated with it. Especially at the time, the attitude amongst the Catholic Church and many Catholics was this idea of once you're a sinner, you're always a sinner. When you look at other literature of this era, you will find this concept of becoming a sinner and then always being a sinner as a result to be a very constant theme. And so if we think about how just almost one note and one mind and one track the group that was fighting against Dracula was, and how seemingly equally one note Dracula himself was, and this idea of it being these are the righteous people and these are the evil people, and not only are they righteous, but they believe themselves to be, and they talk about that all the time, and they toot their own horn all the time. And they are supposedly fighting this evil, but they're fighting it in a way that desecrates these objects that are supposedly so important to them in their religion, potentially desecrating the religion itself with their own beliefs. And not only that, but this evil that they're driving out is a Catholic allegory in its own right. So we almost have two separate allegories for the Catholics in this story, where one side of them are these self-righteous, holier than thou people who are, again, desecrating the religion in order to fight the evil. But the evil that they're fighting in the story is a separate Catholic allegory for the blood-drinking, colonization, like violence side of Catholicism. This combined with, I'm going to go back to what I said about the portrayal of Lucy and Mina really bothering me, but even at the time it almost seeming purposeful that Mina was the one who always figured stuff out, because there's a lot of disrespect of women, especially at the time, but even now we see it within Christianity, and this idea that women are supposed to be subservient to men. Bear in mind, that's not backed up by the Bible, but whatever. We don't have time to unpack that right now. There is this belief that God wants women to be subservient to their husbands. And so they keep trying to separate Mina from them and act like she's different from them and protect her from the shock of everything that they're doing and talking about, because she's not as strong as they are, despite Mina really being the brains of the operation and her being the one who actually figures all of that out and helps them and protects them, while at the same time herself being corrupt by this devil figure. Where part of what a lot of people talk about when they talk about the symbolism with vampire stories, and especially Dracula and his preying on the women in the stories, is this idea of him being this allegory for the devil, where he is the tempter that tempts Eve, that then tempts Adam. if that makes sense. So, you know, in the story of Genesis, the devil gets Eve to eat the apple, and then Eve gets Adam to eat the apple. And so you can see how Dracula is infecting the women. And so, I mean, it's a potential that just he himself views women to be weak, and that's why he put all of that in the book. That is entirely possible. But there is a more charitable interpretation of this in which you almost wonder if his portrayal of the women in the story is supposed to be referential to the way that women were treated at the time within the Catholic Church. But that's not to say that I think every moment of this book that didn't feel the best. I don't know how to describe it, but the moments where, again, it's obvious it was written by a white man in the 1800s, I don't think all of the moments can be chalked up to that. I've already talked about the portrayal of the Slovakian people as well as the Romani people and how off-putting that is. But knowing that he was Irish leads me to wonder, because he also kind of portrays Irishmen and basically anybody who isn't English as kind of an idiot. And again, it's like, is this commentary on the English people themselves and the Catholic people and how they view the people around them? Although England would have been predominantly Protestant at the time. But anyway, was all of that more commentary on the English people and how they view the world around them? I don't know. Or maybe that's how Bram Stoker viewed the world. But whenever he portrayed somebody who wasn't English or Dutch in the story, the portrayal of them is just like chock full of stereotypes and icky and not fun to read. And specifically Quincy, I want to talk a little bit about Quincy, because Quincy is canonically a Black American, which is a very interesting choice for a white man in the late 1800s to have made. And I would love to believe that he threw him in there for good reason, to make a point, but I couldn't really get to the bottom of what that point was, to be honest. Quincy is in the story, but on the outskirts of it. He comes up when he's needed, and he's kind of used. Again, if I were really giving Bram Stoker the most charitable interpretation of this book that I could, Quincy is almost used like a tool by all the other people in the story. He genuinely disappears for like large swatches of pages at a time, and he only pops back up when he's needed and when they need something from him, and in the end he gives his life when everybody else survives the whole ordeal. And if I'm correct as to what the rest of the commentary was, then there is an interpretation of that in which Bram Stoker potentially could be saying that is how Black people were treated at the time and still are, where they aren't actually treated as equals or considered to be equals and are really only used and discarded, as opposed to being treated as the same as everybody else. It potentially could be that, or it could just be that he himself was a white man in the 1800s writing this story. But I can't think of a reason, like at the time, people wouldn't have been pushing for more diverse stories. Like people were still really racist. I can't imagine that there was like this big push for more Black characters in literature at the time. And so it makes me feel like there was a reason why he made Quincy Black. Potentially there was commentary in it, or potentially he just wanted to make Quincy Black. I don't know. And that was my read of Dracula. I had to pause filming for a bit, and so I took the corset off, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't really feel like trying to get it back on. That corset is so hard to put on by myself. It's my hardest one, but that's okay, because all we really need to film is an outro. That's gonna be it for me today, you guys. I had a ton of fun reading this. I still feel like my thoughts on it are a little bit half-baked, but I wanted to present them anyway because I like it sometimes when I'm in the process of thinking out stuff with a book to talk some of the stuff out and see what you guys say, and I feel like it enhances my thoughts. And so I'm leaving the door open for me to return back to Dracula later on, because I feel like I didn't even touch the whole like vampires as seductresses thing and the sensual side of things, and also the way that vampires have become a little bit of an allegory for gay men and all of the correlations there. There's just like, there's so much more. Like there's actually so much that we could talk about when it comes to Dracula and vampire books in general, all of that. So I want to hear your guys' thoughts. Have you read Dracula? If so, how did you feel about it? Do you agree with my interpretation? Do you disagree with it? What do you think? I love you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!